Thanks. Good evening. I'm Marcus Bointon. I'm here to talk to you about privacy and how we can, or the kind of things that you're required to do by the law, and then how we can actually have a look at some websites and see how well they do or don't comply with those things. Just to give you some background of how I fit into this in PHP. I was actually born in Bournemouth and lived in Highcliffe, so I'm sort of local, except I now live in the French Alps, so I'm not local anymore. I've been using PHP for a long time. I'm the maintainer of PHP Mailer, which most people have used at some point. And I found out recently it actually is the second most forked PHP project on GitHub, which is kind of astounding. But I think this is largely because it gets used a lot in universities. Anyway, yeah, so that's my background in this. Now, the reason that I use PHP Mailer is that I have an email marketing company called smartmessages.net. And that made me think a lot about privacy and security and ways that we can keep people's data safe. Because I wanted to build a system that treats subscribers the way that I would want to be treated if I was a subscriber. So I've applied that throughout the development of this, although I've got kind of more aggressive on the privacy direction than I used to. So I've had lots of experience of doing bad things as well as good ones, but nowadays I do good things. Anyway, so to start off, just have a quick rundown of some of the privacy laws and where we are amongst those. The first thing really is this thing. Back in 1981, the Council of Europe put together a thing called Convention 108. And this is an interesting bit of law because it's not actually a law. It's more like a template that describes how to go about designing a data protection law. And it's been phenomenally successful, even though you probably haven't heard of it. Over 50 countries have now written their data protection laws based on Convention 108. So it's actually a pretty big deal, even though it's been around for that long. The next big thing that came along, certainly the big thing in the web era, was the 1995 Data Protection Directive. Now, because this is a directive at the EU level, it meant that it was subject to implementation by each of the member states of the EU. And because of that, it ended up varying quite a lot. So while the UK's Data Protection Act was actually really quite an easy read and clear and sort of simple to implement, it suffered from being quite different to some of the implementations in other countries. So things in Spain and Germany, for example, were much stricter than the UK. You can get away with a lot in the UK. This was followed up in 2002 by the e-privacy directive. So again, this was subject to implementation. And in the UK, this implementation was called the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation, known as PECA, which is also the cookie law. Which everybody loves to hate, and we'll do plenty more on that. Now, in 2018, quite a lot had changed. Convention 108 was updated to the snappily named 108 Plus, and it was followed by the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, because that's a regulation rather than a directive, it meant that it applied across the whole of the EU uniformly and wasn't subject to individual states' implementation, which meant that it was much more consistent. However, it's actually about probably at least 90% the same as the earlier directive. But some of the differences are quite important. In particular, the ability of information commissioners to penalize companies was enhanced enormously. And it had one other major change to some of the data protection principles that underlay it. In the UK, that was included in the big transposition they did post-Brexit, just essentially pull all the EU laws that apply to the UK into EU law. And then it was also followed up with the UK Data Protection Act in 2018. Big things that happened last year, in fact, 1 year ago this week, I think, was the collapse of Privacy Shield, which was the agreement between Europe and the US about data transfers and sort of fair handling of data and complaints and follow-up and everything else. That was defeated by this guy called Max Schrems, who is very much a privacy advocate from Austria. And there is no law to replace that yet. And that now does really mean that the majority of companies that are transferring data between Europe and the US are actually doing so illegally. this is a problem. There are these other things called SCCs, standard contractual clauses, and they do provide some element of a way out. However, they're still not very good for handling transfers to the US. So something's got to happen there because so much is dependent on the US as far as internet infrastructure goes. So what are we in line for in future? Well, the Data Protection Directive, which is still in force from way back in 2002, is badly need an upgrade and also to be made more uniform across the whole of the EU. And that's scheduled to be replaced by the e-privacy directive. And that's also going to be followed up with a thing called the DSA, the Digital Services Act. And that's all about things like removing content and giving more powers to combat the kind of bad things being done by companies like Facebook. And we might see some of those around the end of 2021. In the UK, we've got the Online Safety Bill in progress at the moment, which is something of a disaster waiting to happen. And that's already been pushed into next year, and it's unlikely to end well. If you're a developer, go read some of the things they're suggesting and you'll be going, oh my God, how do we do that? So that's likely to be a problem in the next year or so. Now, looking at what these laws actually cover, there's a big split into three separate things regarding who the people are, who the various roles are relating to data that we store. And the most important of these is the data subject. This is a person that data is about. One of the key concepts in GDPR is something called personal data. And this is very simply defined. It's just data which is attached to an individual. It doesn't matter what that data is. And it's not the same thing as personally identifiable information, which is actually nothing to do with GDPR. In fact, I'm not entirely sure where the term came from, but it's not in pretty much any of the legislation. The definition in GDPR of personal data is different because it doesn't have to be identifying to qualify as personal data. Now, GDPR doesn't concern itself with data that's not about people. And so say we take a piece of data like a color value, like an HTML hex code. By itself, this is not personal data. GDPR doesn't care what you do with it. But if you store that color value as somebody's favorite color, it is personal data because it's attached to a person. It doesn't have to be identifying either because it's actually extremely difficult to identify, to anonymize people in a way that's actually effective. You might find, somebody can be uniquely identified by a single property like their email address or a phone number or something, but they can also be identified by a collection of things that are not individually identifying. So somebody called John living in London, that's pretty anonymous, but somebody called John living in Ulaanbaatar is probably quite easy to nail down. So it's very much context dependent about who qualifies as being personal data or not. The next role, which is probably most of you, is the data controller. And this is the person that is responsible for the data and looks after it and is ultimately liable for it legally. Now, for the most part, you don't do everything yourself and you want to farm stuff out. And there are lots of third parties that you can do that for. And those people are called processors. So a processor is somebody that the controller says, hey, I want you to do this for me and using, I want you to do this operation on this data, which I'm holding about these subjects. And so those three fit together. Now, processors are a likely cause of problems with privacy because they're generally speaking able to subcontract. So you might find that a data processor has a bunch of subcontractors and those contractors can have further subcontractors. And so you get these long chains of responsibility and it's extremely difficult to keep track of who is actually looking after this data and whether they are actually, have agreements in place that say that they are going to handle your data correctly and they're not going to just flog it to anybody that they encounter. But you, as the controller, are ultimately responsible for everything that your processors do, no matter how bad that is. So you need to pick your processors pretty carefully. So now we know how things fit together there. There are a set of these data protection principles that are parts of pretty much all of the data protection laws that I've covered so far. And there are 6 of these, and only one of them is new in GDPR. First up, that any processing you do has got to be lawful, fair, and transparent. So anything you do, you've got to say, we're collecting data, we're doing this with it. And it's all, and the things that you say you're doing have got to be legal. That's reasonably obvious, but it's there and it's a requirement. When you do collect data, you've got to say exactly why you're doing it. And those reasons must be legitimate. And you've got to say exactly what you're going to use that data for. Once you do that, you then got to make sure that the data you've captured is actually adequate for what you're going to use it for. For example, if you're going to send somebody something, then you need sufficient information about their address and where they live in order to actually send them the thing. But once you've said why you're going to use data for something, you need to stick to that. And you'll see why in a minute. You should store data no longer than is strictly necessary. So how long is necessary? Well, if it's an ongoing thing, say for example, like I open a bank account, my bank is going to hold data about me for as long as I hold the account. And the same would apply to many web services. But if somebody stops using your service, how long are you going to keep the data after that? How are you going to find out? How are you going to check with them? Do you have procedures to find out how long this is? So that's something that you need to consider. If, for example, they've just signed up with you to do one thing once, then it would be sensible for you to say, actually, I'm going to delete this after a month, in order to make sure that you're not left holding the baby when a data breach comes along and you suddenly find that you're holding more data than you should have done. Now, this box here is really accuracy, integrity, and confidentiality, the CIA triad, which is pretty much summed up as security. So this is really concerned with a lot of low-level things. So this is about things like using TLS, using encryption in appropriate places, using hashes to validate contents, to making sure you're not messing up character sets and screwing up the accuracy of your data. Because some data can be sensitive. So if you make a mistake with the transcription of data between systems, you can mess things up very badly for people, especially in sensitive areas like medical records. The one thing that's different in GDPR is the addition of this one. All the other 5 are actually in the UK's Data Protection Act from 1984. They've been around for that long, basically unchanged. But GDPR said you had to demonstrate compliance with all of these principles. And that means that all of these decisions that you make relating to these principles, you need to document them, because you've got to be able to justify why you acted a certain way when you chose to handle data in that way. And why you're processing data is called a basis for processing. And there are a bunch of these. The most straightforward one of these is contract. So this is where somebody, say, buys something from you, it establishes a contract. You're going to handle their data as part of your act to fulfill that contract. And so, for example, you need their address so that you can send them the thing that they bought. That's your basis for processing. You don't need any other reason to process it. You're required to do that in order to fulfill the thing that you said you were going to do. Next up, you might be required to do something by the law. So, for example, in the UK, you have to keep employee insurance data for 40 years. And the reason for that is apparently due to the asbestosis claims from the 1970s, where companies had to show that they actually had sufficient health cover back then. There might be other reasons, typically things like tax, pensions, just a straightforward legal requirements. Next up, we've got the vital interest. This is all about an individual, just sort of taking people one at a time. And you don't need to have any sort of upfront arrangement if you're acting in the vital interest of somebody. So if you have some data that has a direct bearing on the well-being of that person, then you have permission to use it, essentially immediately, with no particular other recourse. And you're not required to have a contract, you're not legally obliged, but that means that you're not going to be sued for revealing that information because you're acting in the vital interest of the person. On a larger scale, there's a public interest, which is issues with an individual person that might affect larger numbers of people. So they might have some nasty transmissible disease. Now, those are all quite straightforward. And now it gets a little bit more complicated, particularly this one. This is a really tricky one. largely because this gets abused a lot, and that is legitimate interest. And the reason that exists is really for things like fraud prevention, anti-money laundering regulations. Now, when you say that we have a legitimate interest to process this data, you need to preserve what that original justification is. You can't expand it later or apply it retrospectively. A really great example of this actually is something that Facebook did. They said, we want to use your phone number as part of a two-factor authentication system. That's perfect. No problems with that at all. That's a really good application of legitimate interest. It's not something that's covered by any of the other things. It's something you're stating in advance why you're going to use it. It fulfills something useful. That's great. The only problem is what happened next. Facebook collected all these phone numbers and then sold them to advertisers. That's just like a total travesty of the whole thing. And I'm not quite sure what happened legally after that, but I certainly hope they got it in the neck for it. So when you say that you're going to use something on the basis of legitimate interest, there are 3 tests that you have to apply. And they are that you have to define the purpose for which you're using this basis for processing. You have to establish that you actually have a necessity to use that. And then you have to balance those aspects against whether it should legitimately override the fundamental rights of an individual. And generally speaking, it won't do, especially if you're talking about using this for marketing, which is the place that you see it most often. Yes, anyway. So the last one of these is probably the first one that you thought of, which is consent. Now, consent is different to all the others, not least because the times that you should use consent are really only when the basis is not covered by one of the others. It's the basis of last resort. If you can't do it under any of the other things, then consent, you can get a green light to do basically anything, so long as you actually state precisely what that is and fulfill all the other requirements that we've seen already. So anything that you gain consent for must be fair, transparent, and proportionate. You can't, like, for example, have a checkbox on your website that goes, yeah, you know, if I close this page, then you're going to have my kidneys. It needs to be proportionate to the kind of thing you're asking for. You need to make sure that it's fair and clear. If somebody doesn't understand why you might be processing their data on the basis of legitimate interest or consent, then it's effectively considered invalid. It's effectively as if you hadn't even asked. And that's why the dark patterns that we see in a lot of cookie consent things are actually completely useless. So next set of things you need to know, especially useful from a development perspective, privacy by design principles. Now, privacy by design is a term coined way back in '95 by Anne Cavoukian, who is an ex-information commissioner in Canada. And it has 7 high-level principles for designing systems that respect privacy. They are sometimes criticized as being vague because they are very broad and general, but the idea of them isn't to give you, it's like, you know, you must provide a cookie checkbox or something like that. It's to give you general ideas, an approach to how you develop systems, whether they're online or on paper or anything. It just applies to all kinds of systems. And it's cited as part of GDPR, although it's just like an appendix rather than actually part of the law. Now, the idea with these is to make you think and to put you in situations where you need to have a look at your development processes and think, well, how am I going to deal with this? So I'll just quickly go through these. First up, that you should be proactive, not reactive. The idea is to try and get ahead of things, anticipate things that could conceivably go wrong. So this is to doing things like making sure that you're not keeping data for longer than you should do, that you're only capturing data that you actually need to capture. The idea here is that imagine that at any random moment you had a data breach. What situation would you find yourself in if that had happened? Would you find that you, in fact, you could go, actually, we're all good here. You know, everything's encrypted. We haven't got any more data than we should have. We've deleted all the old stuff. It's all cool. You know, it's bad that they got our data, but effectively there's very little damage being done because we were ahead of the game. Privacy is the default. If somebody does nothing, their privacy should be preserved as far as possible. Embedding privacy into design. This is quite hard to do, though weirdly, something very similar to this was actually part of my master's way back in '93, which was all about embedding design rules into design systems or visual languages and so on. But the idea here is that you really want privacy aspects to be embedded in the tools that you're using. And one of the things that I've been very heartened to see in Laravel is there are quite a few modules that can really help get privacy right into the kind of the model layer of your applications. So that's things like recording the basis for processing that you're using in your modules and fields, how long you're expecting to keep those bits of data from, additional metadata about where data has come from, all this kind of stuff. There's a new feature in the very latest version of Laravel, actually, which is there's a new trait called prunable, which is specifically designed to help you delete data that's out of date and that shouldn't be kept anymore. So we really like seeing that kind of thing embedded into the design layer. Full functionality, positive sum, not zero sum. Very often you see privacy presented as something that if you're going to do privacy, then you can't do something else. And that kind of zero sum thinking is quite common in sort of established sort of IT environments, that it's always got to be this trade-off. And this is really not necessarily the case. There are plenty of things where an enhancement in privacy can actually allow you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. I think probably a good example of that is end-to-end encryption. There are lots of things that you can build on top of end-to-end encryption, which is very much a privacy and security feature that are very much an enhancement. They allow you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So we don't want to say, oh, that because we've got this, we can't do that. Let's try and avoid that. End-to-end security, full lifecycle protection. The idea here is that right from the very first time somebody hits your website until the point when their last record falls off the end of your logs and you've deleted all data relating to them, for that entire lifetime, you're taking care of their data. So it means that you can be doing things like encryption at rest. You can look at homomorphic encryption, that everything is using TLS. You've got right security headers set and so on, or your backups are encrypted, all that kind of stuff. You want to make sure there are just no leaks. There are no places where that data can escape to places where it shouldn't do. Visibility and transparency. Well, this relates very much back to some of the earlier data protection principles we saw in GDPR. And they occur here for the same reason. People will feel much more comfortable with you if you're completely open and transparent about what you're going to do with your data and how you're going to look after it. Unless, of course, you're actually proposing to do evil things with their data, in which case, yeah, keep it to yourself. And ultimately, respect for user privacy, putting them in control. One of the things I like to do here is look at things like settings pages. Have a look at what control people have over their own data. Make sure that they don't even have to come and ask you how to get hold of a copy of your data because it's so clear and obvious to them beforehand. Just making sure that they have all the facilities they need to take care of their own data that you happen to be looking after for them on a semi-permanent basis. So having taken all those into account, one of the questions that always comes up is, do I need to show a cookie consent banner? And the answer to that, of course, is no, you don't. Now, there are several reasons for that. The law doesn't actually tell you precisely, which circumstances. It's a general thing that you need to appreciate. But the chances are you are using one of the things that does require a cookie consent banner or a consent banner. So these things might be if you're setting anything other than non-essential cookies, and that really comes down to anything but first-party session cookies. Anything beyond that, you don't have to ask. So that means that you've got to be quite careful about this because it's really easy. For example, WordPress plugins are forever going, oh, actually, I really want to get the user to store this preference for me, and I'm just going to store a cookie. It's kind of leakage. You get these cookies leaking out of third-party components, and that can be hard to stay on top of. That's a good reason to write stuff yourself, though. It doesn't apply to just cookies. It applies to anything which can involve sharing data with a third party, and that includes tracking scripts like Google Analytics. So strictly speaking, if you think you're in a position where you need to show a consent banner and get permission, you need to do that before you've even loaded the script. Because although Google Analytics has some properties within it that you can set that say, hey, Google, don't log the IPs of these users, it's actually too late by that point. The act of requesting the Google Analytics script from them has already given them the IP, way outside any of the controls that are happening on the scripting inside it. So you really need to ask this consent question really early on in the process, or ideally not ask it at all. Sharing anything with third parties, it doesn't have to be scripts. So for example, Google Fonts. Now, I don't know for sure if Google Fonts are fed into their real-time bidding system, but I think they'd be almost negligent if they didn't. And if I was Google implementing this, I would want to be getting every single bit of data I can to feed into their money-making machine, which is their real-time bidding system. And that would apply to Google Fonts and loading scripts from CDNs, just anything. So generally speaking, again, you should be either asking up front or avoiding the problem by doing things like proxying. Now, I noticed actually recently Spacey.be, who are a great builder of Laravel and PHP packages, have actually got a Google Fonts package which does precisely this. You install it in your system, you can tell it a Google font to use, and it goes and preloads it and then serves it from your own domain. So it means that Google never gets to see the end user's IP or anything else about them. So that's a really nice privacy enhancement. And it also tends to make things go faster because Google CDNs are horribly slow. A lot of the cookie setting widgets you see are basically flogged by ad networks, and they are just filled with dark patterns, which make them mostly pointless. Essentially, if you're going to try and hide what it is you're actually doing, then having a big complicated cookie widget that requires you to click lots of stuff is completely counterproductive. They won't count anyway because of the transparency requirements of the of consent that we saw in the basis for processing, which means that they may as well not have asked. They could save themselves an awful lot of hassle. However, the reason they do that is to try to make the law look bad when it's actually their own actions which are causing this. The whole reason that the law exists is because there is just so much widespread abuse. And one of the reasons why it hasn't gone away is actually down to a lack of enforcement. And unfortunately, the UK is one of the worst offenders from that point of view. The UK's ICO has been absolutely terrible about upholding the law. And if you go and look on the ICO's own website, it's quite easy to find things that are actually not legal. And that's from the regulator. You know, how is everybody else supposed to react to that? And again, privacy by default. If you just continue to use a website, nothing should be tracked. Now, that was a subject of a case a couple of years ago called Planet 49 in the European Court. And that finally established once and for all that if you just go continue to use a website, you're not accepting their terms. You still haven't accepted it as far as the law is concerned. So you can't rely on that. So when you're doing all this, one of the other things you see is a privacy policy. Let's have a look at the things that you need in there. The thing that's important about privacy policy is that it's just a vehicle for you to tell your visitors what you're going to do with their data. So it's not something that they have to agree to. It's not like your terms and conditions. It's just a communications thing. It's just saying, this is how we handle your data. Now, because of the record keeping requirements, any changes that you do make in your privacy policy, you need to record them so that somebody can go and find out what privacy policies were in place at the time that they signed up with you or whatever else they did with you. So in there, you need to identify who the controller and all the processors are, describe what data is collected, when, why, where it goes, how long it's kept for, all the other things that we've seen, list all the third parties that data might be shared with, give them information about how to request access to their information. A DSAR is a data subject access request. And it also needs to list what opt-out or objection procedures they have. So if, for example, you want your data to be deleted from a site, how do you do that? The privacy policy needs to say that. So with all that done, we've kind of covered got a quick background of what's in the what the law requires. We can then have a look at how to actually test things. So a quick rundown of these. First off, just go visit the site. Look at the cookie pop-ups that appear, cry out their evil dark patterns, have a read of their privacy policy, open developer tools, have a look at the cookies and scripts that they're loading. So with that said, I'm going to do exactly that. It's time to do a bit of window switching. Stop that and share this one. Okay, hopefully you can see that. I've got this on quite a big screen. Hopefully it's not too small for people. Okay, so I've picked a few choice sites to go have a look at. And this is Time magazine. Now, one thing that's obvious about that is that it's a US-based site and thus is not subject to GDPR or the UK Data Protection Act or anything else. However, I am visiting from outside the US, and so that's of interest. So this is the pop-up that they presented us with. You notice that the only sort of highlighted thing on here is I accept. So notice that this isn't kind of fair. It's not giving me an easy way to say, actually, no, I don't want you to do any of this. I've got this show purposes thing. If I scroll down, there's nothing else there. Now, because they're legally required to do so, they do list their partners. So let's have a look at that. Now, there's a scroll bar here. And there's quite a lot in here. And if you can see the rate I'm scrolling and the rate the scroll bar is moving, you can see there's a lot. So every single one of these companies gets to see any data about me that is exposed by my browser. So for a start, that's going to include my IP address, but it's also likely to include other things that can effectively be handled, treated as a fingerprint. So I'm just going to go back out of that. I can then go show purposes. So we can have a look at what are they actually using our stuff for. So the beginning here, this is looking quite promising. So we've said that strictly necessary cookies are allowed and you don't have to ask consent for those. That's fine, no problem there. And look, these ones are turned off by default. That's pretty cool. But then we scroll down here and we find we've got some other ones. So we've got this prevention of fraud. Well, that sounds like they're using legitimate interests there, but it's not giving me a chance to object to processing there. But then we've got these other ones down here. We've got the ability to combine offline data sources to deliver ads and content, to link different devices. So this is them saying they're going to track me not only when I'm viewing this site on my browser here, but they're going to try and track me when I do it on my laptop, on my mobile, or anywhere else that I do it through. And it's marked as always active. I've got no way out of this. This is really not good. And the only thing that it's giving me on this screen here, I've still got this confirm my choices. I have no way out here. So this is not really a good example of that. So what's a good example of a privacy policy? Well, this is the UK government's one, and this is actually really good. I don't know if you're, or you probably all are familiar if you've had to do a tax return or anything, but the UK government, quite a long time ago now, put together this GovUK approach to building web properties that are parts of the UK government. And it's been enormously successful and has had some really good things come out of it. For example, sort of unifying authentication across government departments, because previously they had like sort of 100 different authentication systems across different parts of the government. So you can see here, they're doing all the things that we expect them to do. I mean, this is, you know, it's reasonably obviously has to be legally compliant, and they're going to be quite careful about doing so, being who they are. So it's describing the data they collect. It's telling you that they are using Google Analytics, and it tells you where that data goes. It tells you why they're using the data, the legal basis that they're using for processing. In particular, because they're the government, they get to have a big say on things done in the public interest. And not many companies can say the same thing. what they do with the data, including explicitly things that they are not going to do. And this includes things like sharing the data for third-party marketing purposes. So that's kind of good to read, and it's reassuring. How long they keep it, and they gives you some explicit limits of 2 years and 120 days for different purposes. Where the data is stored, they give you a notice here that some of it may be transferred outside the EEA, but that's a result of using Google Analytics. And how you go about exercising your rights and who you should complain to and so on. So this really contains everything that you would expect to have in a privacy policy. That's a good way of seeing things. So have another look at a third party. This is Spotify. And again, they've got a list of partners here. And this is another one of these ones that just goes on and on and on and on and on. And notice they are all opted in by default, even though this is the UK site. This is just wrong. They should not be doing this. I can then also have a look at their cookie settings. And as you can see, it's all quite complicated. And again, they're doing the same kind of thing as we saw on time, that they've got this delivering ads, combining data sources. There's a lot here that I'm not particularly happy with, and I'm not happy that I don't have a way of opting out of these. It's really not good, and it's really not allowing me a reject all or anything. It's yeah, really not good. So this is the kind of thing that we can see from just going and having a look at a site. But there are some tools that can help us find out lots more about security and privacy settings that are on a site. This is a nice one. This is Security Headers, which is written by an English guy called Scott Helm. And so here I've put in the times.co.uk. So are you wanting to ask something, Lucy, or are you just moving your camera?
Oh, I'm just moving my, I was just looking at my phone, sorry.
I thought you were waving at me. Anyway, so this service just checks out some HTTP headers, but particularly ones that are concerned with security. And you can see here that we've got a D rating for the Times. And in particular, it's missing strict transport security, which is very much something that you want to have. It's something that enforces that your site will only be served over HTTPS. And essentially, there is no reason not to use HTTPS for everything these days. It used to be that there were kind of processing overhead issues on the server side and also on client side on very low powered clients. But now, like HTTP2 actually requires HTTPS anyway. So if you're going to get better performance, you actually need to have encryption. It's faster to use it than not. They also don't have a content security policy, which is a pretty surprising omission for something that's such a big site. Content security policy is an important way of combating things like cross-site scripting attacks. So we can see that maybe the Times here isn't really holding up their end of the bargain on ensuring that any data that travels through their site is actually sufficiently protected, and that the visitors of their site are not protected against potential attacks on them. This is something, this website here is Qualys SSL Labs. Now, they're a company that provides sort of consultancy and so on, but they have this fantastic scanner. It's been around for quite a long time. And here we've got an example. I've used it on MailChimp because they're doing some things which are somewhat questionable. You can see here that their grade was capped to a B. And the reason for that is that they've still got enabled TLS 1 and 1.1 versions. Now, those have actually been dropped from all major browsers now. They're not even supported. So there's not really many reasons to actually support those at all. It may mean that some very old clients can't connect to your service, but really you need to look at your audience to see if that's really a concern. So it gives us lots of information about the security certificate, which is, they're doing that fine. Further down here, we can see other things, the TLS protocols they support. So while they are supporting some old protocols, they are failing to support TLS 1.3. And that's really quite surprising as well, because TLS 1.3 has been around for a couple of years now and actually has some major performance benefits. So they're really just kind of, and it's supported in all the major browsers. So they're just throwing away performance here, which is a bit of a shame. You can see that some of the Cypher suites they've got configured are marked as weak. And some of them are lacking this FS part here. This stands for forward secrecy, which is a way of ensuring that if somebody captures data now, they can't decrypt it later, even if they get hold of your private key. So this is quite an important feature to have. It's actually a requirement of backends supporting iOS applications, and it has been for quite a while. Similarly, actually back on TLS, TLS is actually the minimum requirement for iOS and has been for a couple of years now. Now, the reason for allowing old versions of TLS is that it can allow you to have compatibility with really old hardware. So you can see that TLS 1.0 is allowing them to support back to Android 4.3. Now, I suspect that all of these Android versions together actually don't really amount to much of an audience. So yeah, that's not really much use. And we're missing out on a lot of things here. They're not using HTTP 2 either. So there's a lot of holes in this configuration. It could be an awful lot better. But as far as major security holes go, they're not too bad at all. They've got some OCSP stapling is enabled, and they're not marked as vulnerable to anything critical. So that's good. So anyway, this is a useful tool. Apply it to your own sites, see how you come out. You want really minimum of an A grade. This is a great service. This is one of the first proper sort of privacy level scanners that I found. You type in a domain and just hit check. So I've chosen wired.com, and you'll see why, because this is just an amazing example. It's like, would you even dare to propose doing some of the things that they do? So I've submitted their domain, and you can see that it's automatically going and checking the insecure one. It's just got the HTTP there. It doesn't have HTTPS because it wants to check all the things to do with transitioning to secure sites. So you can see that they are doing some things right. They are using HTTPS by default, so they send a redirect there. But you can see we've got some pretty big numbers here and also some little red flags. So we can go and have a look at their settings. And again, this is a little bit like the security header site, except it goes into quite a bit more detail and telling you precisely why it's complaining about these things, so that it doesn't apply to subdomains. So for example, if you had subscribers.wired.com, that wouldn't be covered by this policy. Their content security policy, well, you can see they're picking lots of holes in it here. They're not protecting against frame ancestors, which means that sites can be subject to clickjacking and sort of frame takeover, which is a good way of getting legitimate users subjected to cross-site scripting attacks. There's just quite a few problems there. They're doing the basic. They're not reporting things to third parties at all. They are not setting their referrer policy header. Now, this can be really bad. Say you're on a website that stores information about, say, lab tests from medical procedures. It's quite common for those sites to not actually be terribly well implemented, and they will often contain information in the actual query string. And if you follow those links to some external site, the referrer may actually include that full URL if you don't have a referrer policy set. And that will mean that it leaks the contents of the origin source page to third parties. And that's really not something that you should be allowing, especially if you're handling sensitive data. There are plenty of other values you can set for referrer policy that let you choose things a little bit more finely rather than all or nothing. But that's generally not good. Now, sub-resource integrity, this is a security check where you have a hash of any script that you're loading from an external source. And these have become increasingly important because of the increase we've seen in supply chain attacks, where somebody manages to get into a content delivery network and replace some of the scripts in there with things that do nasty things to people. If you had SRI set and hashes set on all of the scripts that you were loading from those places, you would be immune to those attacks. But you can see that here, they're not. And this is quite a long list. Now, one of them in here is a favorite. Google Tag Manager. Google Tag Manager is, if you're responsible for the privacy on a site, you really need to be paying attention to what's going on with that. Because although you as a developer essentially just go, hey, Google, install Google Tag Manager, it then tends to get handed over to marketing people. And with Google Tag Manager, it's generally possible for them to go and log into Google's site and actually control what tags and what extra services are loaded on top of the Google Tag Manager. So even though you as a developer only installed one script, it may actually mean that a ton of other stuff also gets bundled in and it's out of sight of the developers and so on. So you may find that your site has actually got a whole load of scripting happening in it that you don't even know about. And again, they're not doing so well on the HTTP headers either. They set a ton of cookies, and look, their flags on their cookies are pretty much all missing. So many of these things, anything that's a session, so for example, we've got a session here that's not set to be transferred over secure things. This means that it's really ripe for being intercepted by cross-site scripting attacks, and they can try and do things like emulate logged in users and things. So these are really quite dangerous things to have. You really want all of these things to be green ticks. Same site is a very nice defense against cross-site request forgery. Stops people hammering sign-up forms and things like that. Well, it can do. So you can see this list is pretty long. Then we also have a whole bunch of third-party cookies. Now, interestingly, the third parties are actually making a better job of most of their cookie flags than the actual host site is. But again, you can see there's a whole bunch of them. Now, to be fair, some of these are actually things that belong to Condé Nast, who are the owners of Wired. And so some of these names are actually names within their own company. But down here, we do have Google, even though when this does its emulated visit to the site to collect all this data, it does so as basically a brand new user. So these cookies have been set without anyone giving consent. So that's not a good sign either. It also makes a whole bunch of third-party requests, nearly all of which are in the US, even though I'm accessing this from, well, effectively from Sweden, or actually it might be Finland, actually. There's a thing at the top that says somewhere, says where it's actually collected from. So I really like this checker. It's a great thing to point at your own sites. So if I point this at one of my own sites, this is one that I've been setting up recently, and green ticks everywhere, no trackers, lots of green ticks, no cookies, no third-party requests. So that's the kind of thing that you should be trying to get if you can. The other side effect of this is performance, which I'll cover in a second. So this is the Wired web page, and this is the kind of thing that having a lot of ad trackers on a site leads to. So you can see here, look at the numbers. We've got a 20-second load time, loading 6.7 megabytes of data. That's a lot. So if we have a little scroll down of their waterfall view, this is just stunning. I can't imagine shipping a site that's just got this much stuff. And all of this is stuff that directly affects the end user. All of these sites are tracking what they're up to. This is a kind of a real horror story as far as privacy goes. And it just goes on and on. It's unbelievable. So in fact, in there, we've got 701 requests to load that page, which is just completely insane. Now, to actually see that in a different way, this is another tool that's actually part of the web page test. But this is a nice zoomable thing. So the main website there is the wired.com. All of those blue lines coming out from it are outbound requests, so sub requests. So it includes things like style sheets and images too, but it also includes loading scripts from other locations. The size of the blob indicates the amount of data that's transferred from that place. And you can get more information about them just by rolling over them. So this is a nice way of seeing the extent of the network of things that your data is shared with. So this is just me visiting one page, and yet it's led to my data being shared with all of these things. Although in fact, actually, of course, in this case, this isn't my data, it's the user that ran the request map. Now, this is a bit disorganized, and there's another testing tool called Page X-ray. And this I've just dropped in the same URL to Wired, and this gives a much more organized view. And you can see here, if we zoom out, we get the whole stack of all of the different sites that your data is being shared with. So we can see here that very often they get multiple hits. So this thing here, oh, that's hiding behind CloudFront, so we can't actually really tell what's going on there. But some of these go on to like, oh, cookie law. There we are. It's an interesting name. But you can see there that that involves lots of other third parties. So this is like the third party chains that I mentioned right back at the start. But you can see that some of these chains are really quite long. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps down some of these request chains. And these places are spread all over the world, and they may well be outside the jurisdiction that you're expecting to operate from, or that your visitors are expecting to operate from. Now, most of these are in the US, but we've seen some from Canada and Japan and lots of other places. So that's kind of it for those testing tools. I will flip back to this one and show that again. And nearly done. So yeah, so these are some of those automated test tools. The only one of these I didn't show you was this one by the markup called Blacklight. That's actually very similar to the WebCol one. They're both pretty good, but I like WebCol as it was one of the early ones. There are quite a few other services that do something similar. There's a really good service called Hardenize, and that goes into much more detail on the TLS side, and it also covers things like your mail server configuration. So it connects to your mail server and has a look at the security configuration on that as well, because these things apply all over the place. Hackers don't care what route they take to get to your data. All they need is one way in, and you've got to try and block all of them. So it's a perpetual battle, which we're not doing terribly well at the moment. Now, I'm really a developer amongst all this. There are people that are much better at this when it comes to actually explaining the law behind it and giving you some advice about what to do about it. These are the top three there. They're very much three of my favorite people on Twitter for following for privacy and legal stuff. Heather Burns has been doing some fantastic stuff on her blog at Web Dev Law. Pat Walsh gave me some pointers to some of the things that I've shown you today. And Miss IG Geek, Rowena Fielding, is just generally excellent. And there are some other people here. Neil's a lawyer, does lots of stuff relating to privacy. Lots of interesting things from Trial by Truth, and Tim 2040 runs courses on this kind of thing. Now, although I've said the UK ICO is to a large extent useless when it comes to prosecuting people, they're actually still good as a source of information. Some of their stuff is very well presented and very clear. Though it appears to be optional whether you actually have to comply with the law or not in the UK. The Open Rights Group is a body that's really campaigning, trying to make sure that this stuff does get enforced, and that and tries to hold the government to account when they're doing things like the online safety bill, which is generally not good. So that's about it, really. If anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to answer them.